Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Kat. So recently I did a poll on my channel asking you guys which topic you are interested in, and that includes science policy, postdocs in the biotech industry in general, as well as field application scientists. And per your request, you guys are very interested in the science policy field. So today I invited one of my grad school friends who joined as a fellow in the science policy world. I remember back in grad school, he was already very active in the science policy. So I hope this interview with him can help you better understand science policy in general, what they do, working as a fellow in the science policy world, and how the interview process differ from other jobs that are described on my channel. If you're new to my channel, I'm Catherine. I got my PhD in the biomedical field in the United States and currently working as a healthcare strategy consultant. On my channel, I talk about alternative careers, then the academia, and hoping to provide a platform to educate people in academia or students who have or pursuing advanced degree, exploring different career options. If you like such content, please don't forget to subscribe and I'll provide more of such content for you. Without further ado, let's invite my friends. Hey Manar, how's it going?
Hey, Catherine, great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us on this and really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Awesome. For this purpose, I really trying to, have this conversation and share with the audience here to help them understand what is science policy. And for anybody who's interested in science policy, this could provide a very good resource for them to refer back to. So just, as backgrounds, would you mind sharing just a little bit about your educational backgrounds, current position, and responsibilities?
Sure, of course. And thanks again for giving me the platform to talk about science policy. I know a lot of early career professionals are curious about the career path and know relatively little about what it is. So really happy to be able to share. I'm currently the Policy and Engagement Manager at the Innovative Genomics Institute at UC Berkeley. And I work specifically on the Institute's public impact team on the health portfolio. So I cover all things policy, regulation, and stakeholder engagement for the team for health. And to relate that to my background and how I got here, so I'm a trained scientist. I have a PhD in translational biology and molecular medicine, and I did my thesis work on the genetics of rare disease, mostly in the brain, mostly doing CRISPR screens and other preclinical sort of therapeutically oriented work. Did some mouse models, some biochemical assays, some cell work, all of which, in terms of training, I use in my day-to-day in science policy because I do dabble in science and then I do a lot of policy work. But mostly, and we can talk about this a little later too, it's the critical thinking piece that I took away from my PhD that's really, really helpful, and some of the communication. And so during grad school, I learned about science policy and was really interested in pursuing that career because it sort of combines my passion for science, but also for public impact and for big picture thinking, all into one. So similar to, the consulting world where you get to advise um, influential companies or individuals in science policy, a lot of the work is done to advise policymakers and key decision makers on how to use science to really ground your policy solutions in evidence and in data.
Thanks. I think those are really interesting points, and you kind of already alluded to a little bit as why you chose science policy as a job. But just for me, and of course, I think the audience to understand the general picture, like what is science policy and what does it cover? And if you don't mind, just maybe just share a little bit with us.
Of course, yeah. So science policy, really, the way I see it is two different fields, if you like, and within those fields, it's also a very diverse career path, which is in part why it's so exciting. So there's science for policy, which means that you're applying a scientific lens or evidence or data to inform laws and regulations. And that could be things like environmental policy or AI policy, very current, or genome editing, and how do we ensure that it's deployed ethically and responsibly? How should regulations look like for new products that are based on absolutely new modalities like genome editing, or um, cybersecurity? It could be seen as a science policy, a science for policy sort of approach. But then there's policy for science, and that's more about the laws and regulations that influence research, research funding, and the impacts of scientific discoveries. And so that could entail, advocacy work with Congress or with decision makers to increase science funding, or advocating for specific government programs or pilots to be to be to be conducted by, say, an agency. So, for example, you could envision FDA wanting to pilot something, and that's something where policy comes into play to inform science or regulations. So, and then within, science policy as science for policy and policy for science, there are many different career paths. So you could be in an advising role, you could be in an engagement role, you could be in an analysis role, you could be in a more programmatic role where you're trying new things, or being more as like a research type of person. And I would, the listeners, I would really encourage them to look up the science policy career guide put out by the
Mm.
California Council on Science and Technology, and I can share the link with you as well. Um, I think it does an excellent job at breaking down all of these points and highlighting the different types of work and the different types of skills that you need in those career paths.
That's really informative. And I think that helps me to understand when you mentioned your background in CRISPR and did many mouse models, and this could be, genome editing related science and influence policy. So thanks for sharing. Uh, I guess another question, just follow-up question on your background and current positions. Like, how did you get here? Are there like multiple steps you have to take as a graduate student, or maybe postgrads? And just maybe walk us through your path
Yeah.
to your current position, please.
Yeah, so in my case, I just kind of, agnostically explored career options while I was in grad school. I didn't even know that I wanted to leave the bench. I just wanted to know what else was out there.
Hmm.
Um, and I went to many seminars and kind of stumbled upon policy, and it wasn't really well developed where I went to school until two grad students sort of launched this policy group, and with themselves having relatively little background as well. And I just kind of joined it, and I wanted to learn more, and so I did. And sort of from there, things started going. I learned about opportunities for grad students to get engaged on advocacy. So professional societies like the Society for Neuroscience or the American Society of Human Genetics, they have advocacy uh, programs for grad students that are pretty low commitment and not very time intensive, but where you can learn something about say the congressional funding process, or how do you write a policy memo, or how is government structured and how does that affect science. So it was really those kinds of smaller engagements that led me to become the president of the science policy group eventually, where I started doing more programmatic work. So we did a policy 101 lecture series for other interested students and postdocs, and eventually got some microgrant funding from Research America, which is an advocacy group. And that enabled me to bring other early career professionals that are interested in science policy together to work on some infographics, and we designed a website, and we did some programmatic work on science policy, and that really gave me the confidence and the ability also to know what I wanted after grad school. And so from there, I applied and got into science and technology policy fellowship So I went and did my fellowship with the California Council on Science and Technology, CCST for short, and they are the science policy fellowship in the state of California. They are very much modeled after the AAAS fellowship, which many of the listeners may have heard of. That's the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and that's a federal fellowship. So rather than advising the state, you're placed in either an executive branch placement in the federal government, or you're on the Hill advising a lawmaker.
That sounds pretty cool. And congrats on getting the fellowship, and of course now get your current job to compare and contrast and make it a bit fun. Just want to maybe understand a little bit about, what's a typical day look like as a fellow versus as a currently a manager now, and at two different institutions. Maybe just provide your view there.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're very different roles. As a fellow, I was placed, actually, I was in a dual placement. So I was both a policy consultant in the Assembly Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee for the California legislature. And then I was also in a staff position for Assemblymember Bill Quirk's office. And so in those two, a lot of my job was policy analysis. It was stakeholder engagement, constituent engagement, briefings, writing talking points. So maybe those could be, abstract terms to put it a little bit in perspective. Let's say, a new policy is coming. Somebody proposed to pass a bill that would require an agency to measure, let's say, the levels of a water contaminant. You could have a policy or a bill proposal that is very short and just say, we require the state water board to do all of these things, and then that comes to the policy committee. And so it's now the role of the policy analyst to say, well, one, does this make sense? But also two, what do the others think? Is this actually important? Is this a real problem that needs solving? Do we have the money for it? So it starts this conversation, and this is, I think, where the scientific thinking skills really come in. It's you need to ask the right questions, and if you don't know the answers, you need to be able to find the answers with the right people. So this really brings in sort of this, well, one, it's critical thinking, policy analysis. Did the author of this bill actually think this through? And if not, how can you improve it? And then the other aspect of that is stakeholder engagement. It's so important in policy that you ask for different viewpoints, and you ask stakeholders how this will impact them.
It's actually very interesting. There are similarities between, science policy, which I had no idea about, versus consulting or even medical science liaison, which I also talk about on my channel. Because, for example, in consulting, you also have to ask the right questions, right? Be critical thinking about what are the key questions the clients are thinking about. And in your case, will be the policymakers or the actual beneficiaries of the policy. And also you have to do research, both, secondary research, you have to look at reports, like the existing policy out there, if there's any conflicts, or for us, you talk to the key stakeholders who think if this product or this drug would need, how it should be priced, or if they should adopt this product. So I think there are some similarities there, which I found it's quite interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, I was actually interested in consulting early on because it gave me that advising and critical thinking sort of aspect. But what I was looking for, and I think what tilted it for me towards science policy as opposed to consulting, is in policy, you're talking about, a very large group, sometimes even, the public or the state, or the country. Sometimes it's even international, right? And you're thinking about, the global aspect. And I really like that. I like going bigger picture and really thinking about the different players and the different moving parts, and trying to be, as neutral about it as possible. Because the nice thing about a policy committee, even though, politics always plays some role, but I really found myself oftentimes opening up PubMed or opening up, scientific articles to really go into the research that is already out there and saying, okay, well, this, let's say a lobbyist made a claim to me, and I
Mhm.
need to fact check that, right? Because just because the lobbyist says that this product is safe does not mean that this product is safe. It may very well be, but I might read the research and say, well, hold up, this data doesn't make any sense. Let me come back to you and dig a little bit more for the truth, or
Mhm.
for all, all of the truth. And so that iterative process and that back and forth really helps strengthen policy. And I think that's why it's so absolutely critical that we have scientists in Congress, in state legislatures, in executive branch offices that can evaluate data, that can be critical, that can ask the tough questions and not be intimidated by, a lobbyist saying, well, I told you it's this way. Like, it just is. Nothing ever just is, right? And I
Yep.
think bringing that scientific skepticism to the table is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate, you and all the other fellows groups in the science policy really help us fact check everything, which is really critical, especially in this, current climate. And I think you mentioned a bit on the critical thinking and of course bridging different stakeholders, making sure everything is right. And what additional core skill sets a person or someone who's interested in science policy should have before considering this as a future career path.
Yeah, and I think this ties into what I do now more often than not. A lot of times, folks will find themselves not in the legislature, but in a more programmatic role. But I think generally speaking, one really important skill set that you have, aside from critical thinking, which I think is absolutely key, is communicating with diverse audiences. Being able to be succinct when you have to be, when you're talking to a member of Congress and they only have 2 minutes, you need to be able to convey your point in 2 minutes. Um, without jargon. Or maybe you're at a networking mixer and you're in a room with just a bunch of really different people and they all want to know, who are you? What are you doing? And what is the problem you're trying to solve, and why is it a problem? How are you going about it? And can you, argue your point effectively and succinctly? Sometimes you're talking to scientists, and so then you have to put your scientist hat on and let them know that, what, you're not a lobbyist, you're not, somebody who doesn't really have the technical background, but you do have the technical background. You're actually gonna, fact check them, or you might push back on some claims. And so, I think communicating with diverse audiences is absolutely key. The third skill that I would really highlight, and this is something that I do a lot now, is program management. So being able to lead a project or multiple projects, juggle them all alongside each other, and being organized enough, or at least having your organized chaos somehow, and making sure that you're driving things forward, right? Like, it's very easy to get distracted, but you want to be able to keep timelines, keep yourself going. In some instances, like when I was in the legislature, that was much easier because small, very clear sort of responsibilities, and they all had deadlines. And the deadlines oftentimes were, set by law. So you knew you couldn't go over. But then now in my current role at the Innovative Genomics Institute, where it's, I have to drive projects, the timelines might be longer, maybe multiple months, and I need to show progress. And I mean, that's very similar to academic science, where you have a longer term project. And so taking that also from grad school and applying it to the science policy world is really key. But so now, at the Innovative Genomics Institute, I have a project on affordability. I have a project on regulatory. I have a project on policy and engaging individuals on more of the policy analysis and responding to the government for requests for information and things like that. So I think those three things, critical thinking, communication, and program management are really the core skill set that you should bring to science policy.
That's actually also very interesting, and thanks for sharing. I think those skills that most of us, who have PhDs probably already have them. We just never thought we
Absolutely.
could, right? Those are the transferable skills to different industries. So definitely encourage different PhD holders or potential candidates to look for these jobs that can, leverage such skill sets. But
100%.
again, I do have a follow-up question because many of people that follow my channel are actually international students, and they might be in the US or might not be. But I think maybe people are wondering, advising Congress or state legislator, then being a foreigner, would that impact the possibility of getting this type of job?
I would say it's definitely consideration, um, but it's not impossible. So there are certainly state fellowships that accept international applicants, and it's not a problem. So, for example, CCST is open to anyone. And if you're, say, an F1 student, and you want to transition to OPT, CCST has plenty of experience with that. Um, Being mindful of some of the next steps, uh, some legislatures may not be able to hire you after the fellowship. So there are some limitations or some requirements on citizenship. Um, but there are plenty of opportunities out there at nonprofits or at universities or in industry where you could move on and be on your OPT or transition into H-1B status. At the federal level, there are a handful of fellowships that will also accept international students. And then if you wanted to work at an agency, there are also ways. So, for example, if you're interested in regulatory and you want to work at FDA or another agency like that,
Mhm.
um, there are also ways to work as a contractor and be be on a visa. And then state governments also. I know California state government takes international students, or sorry, international applicants, um, and can deal with the visa situation. So I think, there are some limitations, absolutely, um, especially in Congress,
Mhm.
but it's not impossible, and there are certainly career paths. And I know folks that are international um, that have been fine.
That's great. I mean, that's really reassuring. And of course, I think as international students or just workers here in the US, we know not all the jobs are applicable for us, but just knowing there are options or fellowships that they can apply, that's really helpful. Great. And maybe we can kind of shift gear a little bit. Just want to understand a bit about application process in general for people who are interested in this career path. Who should they reach out to? What the resume would look like? What the interview process look like? Just maybe we can start from in general. The general application process. What does it look like?
Yeah, I think even before you start the application process, I would almost add a pre-application step, and that is talk to folks that are doing the thing that you want to do,
Mhm.
right? So talk to fellows if you're applying for a fellowship, talk to program managers in the space if that's the kind of role you want. I did several informational interviews before deciding on the career path or before deciding on a specific fellowship. And those are incredibly helpful because it's not only you're getting a sense for, what to expect in the career, but also what to expect for the application, what to highlight, and how to really put the best foot forward. And then within the application process, if you're talking about fellowships, there's going to be questions about, what you have done to sort of show that this isn't just you woke up one day and you thought, I'm going to apply to a science policy fellowship. So I think I was very deliberate in showing that I had been proactive, that I had collected information and sort of made an educated decision about why I wanted to be in science policy and what that meant to me and what the impact of that decision would be for me in my career moving forward. And then, a lot of times the application process will be multi-months or multiple weeks, with several rounds of interviews. They may ask you to provide a writing sample, or they may send you, a proposed policy that you might have to analyze or
Mhm.
put together a policy memo. And the other thing is, I think some fellowships will actually provide opportunities for you to engage them and ask questions of fellows or alums of the fellowship, which I think is very valuable as well.
Great. I do have a couple of questions, I guess. First of all, for the informational interview, I think that's definitely a great tip, and thanks for sharing. I'm wondering, like, where do you find those people? Do you just go on LinkedIn and then search for titles and institutions, or did you find them through the kind of diligence you did in grad school? Went to those workshops? Oh no,
Yeah,
that's
so
there.
I started with our career development office, and typically the folks that are running these have vast networks and are well
Mm,
connected to folks in all kinds of career paths. That's where I started. I also attended several seminars on the topic. I also engaged with at our school. There was a Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy, and so I actually asked some of the faculty there
mm,
about getting engaged and um, recommending other folks that I talked to. There was several AAAS fellows had come to us and given seminars, so I definitely reached out to them. And then through the professional society that I did advocacy work with, that was also a great opportunity for me to meet people and ask them for informational interviews. And everybody I've ever reached out to, has been more than generous with their time. And I've actually been on the other side of this too, right? Where
yeah.
folks will reach out to me and say, "Hey, I'm really curious about the fellowship. Would you, have some time to chat?" And I love talking about the fellowship, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, I think the methods that you mentioned, those are definitely the most effective ways to reach out to the right people. And they, as you said, are more than willing to help. So I think definitely the takeaway here is reach out through the network that as many as you can, and don't be, intimidated by thinking nobody want to talk to you. If you don't reach out, you never have the opportunity to talk to these people.
Yeah,
So great.
absolutely.
Great tips there. Another question on, I guess you mentioned you did so much work before, right? Even applying anywhere. So I'm wondering what's the timeline look like? Like how far ahead of time does a person need to prepare to, maybe learn how to write a memo and all that kind of process before considering applying to anywhere?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, if you have a year or two before you're graduating or before you're leaving your postdoc, um, to start exploring and maybe engage and do things, that will be great. That will show that you've had, some time to mull it over, mull
Mm,
your decision over to, transition to science policy, especially if it's a fellowship. But but I think, if you don't have that much time and you're really interested, you want to transition, and maybe you're not pursuing a fellowship, but you're pursuing a job, um,
mm,
maybe take the time to read about, the particular issue that you're interested in. Um, Try and look up policy analyses. I mean, I know for California, and I believe also for the federal government and Congress, those are all publicly available. You can just go
oh,
online and pull up a bill and pull up the analysis, and you can read it, and you can see, hey, so this is how the analyst went through the issues and really thought through the different problems and addressed them. So that's something you could start doing. You can also reach out to professional societies, some of which have workshops. So I think that's a great way to learn skills. And then there are also science policy groups and the National Science Policy Network that provide opportunities for training. I believe there's also a science policy course now, and
mm.
yeah, there's plenty of opportunity for you to learn and to get your feet wet and get started on something.
Oh, that's great.
And
I
maybe
did,
just to add, you don't have to have, you know, I have policy memo writing experience. That's not a requirement. It's great if you can say on your resume that you had this opportunity to learn that, but nobody's going to say, "Oh my God, we're gonna reject your application because you've never briefed a member of Congress on policy." That's unrealistic, right?
right. Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. And that's also hopeful for people who want to transition in a short amount of time if there are so many public resources. Great. I think maybe just to wrap up, do you have any last tip for people who want to kind of get into the science policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've mentioned this, right? But find out if this is something that gets you excited. Um, if you're somebody who likes to connect the dots or likes to, see the forest, not just for the trees that are standing in it, but for all the connections that are happening within the forest and between forests, or the forest and the city, or the forest, the city and the moon. If that gets you going, if you're a big picture thinker, but you don't want to venture too far away from science and scientific thinking, I think science policy is ideal, right? That's what gets me going, right? I get to go to my job and talk to the scientists about genome editing and all this cool stuff that they're doing right now at the bench without actually having to pipette anything.
Mm.
But then go and also talk to the folks at FDA or the folks at in industry or the ones with all these really great ideas on how to advance rare disease research and things like that. And so connecting folks and being sort of the bridge between the science and the outside world, if that's interesting to you, um, find it out and get going on, you know, figuring out how to transition into this career. And then practice communicating. Seek opportunities where you can go out and talk to the non-scientists in your network or even in the in the public sphere. Talk to them about things that interest you. Maybe it's political, maybe it's not science related. Maybe you want to learn about climate change, but you're actually a cancer researcher, and you want to brush up and you want to learn, you want to talk to folks. Do it.
Mhm.
Communicating is going to be the bread and butter of your work, because you do it when you're writing, you do it when you're just talking to stakeholders, when you're engaging experts. You want to have a baseline understanding of what they're going to talk about, even if it's not your field at all. So yeah, find out if this is for you, and if it is, communicate.
Awesome. That's definitely a great tip. Well, thanks for sharing your experience and all the tips and on my channel. And I hope we can connect soon in the future.
Yeah, really happy to do it. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too, Catherine.